Continue part 2 of creation versus evolution. After we're through this particular section tonight, we will be going into getting into the Bible as far as taking the creation story, breaking it down. We will be getting into more of that with the next lesson, but tonight we are going to finish part 2 of the creation versus evolution. This is a series I've gotten from Apologetics Press, so you can certainly look that up. You can find it there. Also, I do have a copy of some of it if you want to see that. In Lesson 5, we discussed the idea that creation is a scientifically acceptable explanation for the origin of the universe. Science bears it out. In this lesson, we're going to examine the alleged factuality of evolution, because evolution has been touted to be fact. So much so that they have pushed it as the only way that the world came into existence. But we want to look tonight, what we're going to look at is what they would use to back up that idea that it is a fact. And we're going to look at the evidence that documents why the concepts of creation are more consistent with true science than the idea of organic evolution. Excuse me. Would you mind grabbing me a bottle of water? Thank you. When we talk about, so is evolution, first of all, a fact of science? Is it a fact? No. Let's look at that. Is it a fact? Okay. When we talk about the origin of the universe and those things that are in it, we cannot speak as eyewitnesses. Correct. Anybody here? Well, I mean, some may be close.
I tread lightly.
I'm going to be careful. She lives in my. Did I say that? No, none of us, though. None of us are anywhere remotely old enough to have eyewitnessed it. Matter of fact, we don't know of anybody who eyewitnessed creation. First of all, according to biblical account, in the biblical account of creation, man was the last thing that God created on the last day. He was on day 6, he created man. Well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in between. So man wasn't there when God created. So we don't have any eyewitness or first-hand observers that were there. Thus, any scientific discussion must be based on certain assumptions, hypotheses, or theories put in place after the fact. In other words, we know that something happened, right? Because we're here. We know that there definitely is living organisms. There's life on this planet. We're one of them. But there are millions, and if you want to count all of life, insect and all, there are probably billions of life organisms on this planet. So we know that happened, but we've got to go from what we have. We've got to look backwards. Okay? An assumption, though. An assumption is something that's taken for granted. Well, I assume that Bernie had a shower tonight, because quite often he comes home, and I know this from previous experience, that he would come home from work, and first thing he does, he jumps in the shower. But I could be wrong. That's an assumption. I wasn't there. Somebody else was there. I didn't witness it, right? So that's an assumption, right? An assumption is something taken for granted and represents a legitimate starting point for an investigation. Okay, we assume this happened. Well, let's look further into it and see, did it actually happen? I'm assuming that this happened, but how am I going to find out if it happened? Well, the case of Bernie, I'd have to go to him and say, did you do this? Or maybe I go to Penny and say, did you see him? Or go to Andrew, did you see him? See, there are evidences that I can go to try to find out the assumption that I make about something. Okay, is that understood? Yes. What an assumption is. Okay, we want to know what that is, because when we're talking about evolution, we're going again from here backward. And we've got, first of all, we assume something, but can we base it on evidence, and where does it take us? Where does the evidence take us? Okay? That makes sense? Good. A hypothesis is merely an educated guess or tentative assumption. What I just said about Bernie is an educated guess based upon past previous experience that I know happened. It wasn't a plain assumption, it was an educated assumption. I had something to back it up with. I understood that, and so I made that hypothesis. Okay, does that make sense? We have an assumption, and we have a hypothesis, which is an assumed assumption, or a guess, sorry, an educated assumption. So then, finally, assumption, hypothesis, and now a theory. A theory is a plausible general principle or set of principles that may be used to explain certain phenomena or things that happen that is supported by at least some facts. So a theory is, we take the assumption, okay, and if you take science in school, in high school, in public school, if you take science, and they do, there's a process by where you have to go through the stages in order to get to an answer at the end. You assume something, okay, if I blow up into a balloon, blow air into a balloon, it's going to what? Blow up. Okay, well, here's the balloon. Here's my lungs. Blow into the balloon. Now what do I have? I have a balloon full of what? Air. Well, you went from an assumption to an educated guess to an actual theory. You have a fact. You've seen something happen. Does that make sense? Okay. Many evolutionists claim that evolution has been proven and therefore must be spoken of not as a theory, but as a fact. Most people today, for example, have heard of, maybe haven't heard the names of, but Francis Crick and James Watson are two scientists that share the Nobel Prize for their discovery of the structure of the DNA. Don't ask me how to say the word, whatever. Something nucleic acid, that's right, yeah. DNA, it's short form and it's easy to say. But it's the molecule within each living cell that carries the genetic information. It's what you and I are all made of. It's what tells us to have blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, long fingernails, short cuticles, earlobes that dangle or don't dangle. All those things, all that information in every living organism is all wound down to the understanding of what DNA is. That little strand of information. Okay? So these guys discovered it, shared a Nobel Peace Prize. Several years after their discovery, Dr. Watson wrote a book titled The Molecular Biology of the Gene, in which he stated, quote, "Today, the theory of evolution is an accepted fact." Okay. A few years later, in the August 23rd, 1999 issue of Time magazine, famous Harvard evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould said that, quote, "Evolution is as well documented as any phenomenon in science, as strongly as the Earth's revolution around the sun, rather than vice versa. In this sense, we can call evolution a fact." And so they have purported and said verbally in the media, hey, evolution is a fact. Okay. Is evolution a fact of science? Well, let me read you what a fact is defined as. A fact is an actual occurrence, or something that has actual existence. With that standard usage definition in mind, consider the following. Evolution cannot be considered a fact because it is based on a number of non-provable assumptions. Remember that assumption? That's the very first part. Non-provable assumptions. Several years ago, a well-known evolutionist from Great Britain by the name of Gerald Kirkut boldly listed no less than 7 such assumptions in his widely distributed book, The Implications of Evolution. The first 2 assumptions he listed were these. Number 1, spontaneous generation must have occurred. If you remember from last week, spontaneous generation is the fact that something can appear from nothing. Does that make sense? Remember that one? Something can appear from nothing. So a magician tries to fool you into thinking that he can produce something from nothing, but we all know that a magician uses what? Trickery or deception. He uses deception. Very interesting. Spontaneous generation says that something appeared from nothing. I reach behind your ear and I pull out a loonie. Did it actually come out from behind your ear? No, it did not. It came out because I had it already hidden in my fingers or in my hand or in my sleeve. I deceived you into thinking that. Well, spontaneous generation says that something came from nothing. Is that possible? Well, guess what? It isn't possible because it has never been replicated. It can't be done. Okay? Now, and we'll get into that in a second. So he made 7 assumptions. First two were spontaneous generation must have occurred. So somehow, nothing produced something. And then number 2, spontaneous generation only happened once. You catch that? So spontaneous generation must have only happened one time. Spontaneous generation is the idea that something non-living gave rise to something living without any outside assistance. This concept is the very basis of organic evolution, since evolutionists believe that when the universe first began, it was composed solely of hydrogen with perhaps a few atoms of helium. In order to get life started, they are forced to conclude that those non-living inorganic chemicals somehow turned into something living. But that somehow is an extremely difficult problem for the concept of evolution. Scientists have tried to document that spontaneous generation can occur, yet every single attempt has not only failed, but failed miserably. No one has ever been able to prove that something that doesn't have life, something that's non-living, can produce something that is living. Life comes from life, friend. Life doesn't come from non-life. Therefore, evolutionists simply assume that it happened. Okay? Furthermore, they say that it only happened, they assume that it only happened once. But why? All of life is composed of a singular genetic code, the DNA. Right? Because that code is so extremely complicated, and because it is virtually the same throughout all living things with only minor variations, evolutionists are forced to concede that the events that produced it must have occurred only once. To suggest that it could have happened more than once, and that it produced exactly the same code every single time, would be ridiculous. And no one would believe it, not even an evolutionist. So then something must have come from nothing, poof. That's right. And it must have happened only one time. Doesn't work. There are 2 serious problems with this. First is something is based upon an assumption, never can be considered as a fact. If you're basing everything on an assumption, it can't be considered a fact. It's only assumed. At best, any idea based on an assumption forever remains just that, an assumption. It's not possible logically to build a concept upon an assumption and then assert it as a fact. Since spontaneous generation is the basis of all evolution, obviously you can't get something to evolve if you can't get it to live in the first place. And since spontaneous generation is nothing more than an assumption, because it's never been documented scientifically, and all available evidence points against it, then evolution can't be a fact. You can't get from here to here, because the evidence from where you go from an assumption point the other way. They don't point at the facts, they point opposite. You can't get something from nothing, so therefore it cannot be a fact. You can't get there. Second, as all scientists know, one-time events cannot be studied by using the scientific method. Why is that? Because they're what? One-time events. They only happen what? One time. How do you then experiment with that? You can't. Because why? Because they only happen one time. Does that make sense? It's a revolving door there. Science uses the 5 senses, touch, smell, sight, taste, and hearing, to study those things that are universal, dependable, and reproducible. That's how we learn about things. How do you know that it hurts when you touch the hot stove?
Because it burns you?
Because you feel it. Because you smell it, possibly. Because you see it, possibly. Well, those are all reproducible. They're evidences that come from the fact that you can actually reproduce them. Does that make sense? Simply means that a scientist working in Hong Kong can do an experiment exactly like a scientist in New York City. If both use the same methods, both will get the same results, right? They'll get it the same today, they'll get it tomorrow, 10 years from now, 100 years from now. If the experiment is exactly the same, all the factors are the same, the end result is going to be the same. Doesn't matter where they are, doesn't matter who it is. It's going to end up being the same. But one-time events are neither universal or reproducible. They only happen what? Once. So how do you make it happen again? You can't, because you don't know how. First of all, it's spontaneous generation. Something came from nothing, which they can't prove because they can't make it happen. Cannot be repeated. Evolutionists admit that 2 of the 7 non-provable assumptions upon which evolution is based center on the idea that spontaneous generation must have occurred, and that it must have occurred once. This means that evolution cannot be a scientific fact. Dr. Kirkland admitted this. He said, the attempt to explain all living forms in terms of evolution from a unique source is premature and not satisfactorily supported by present-day evidence. We ain't got it, friend. That's what he's saying. Still says, the supporting evidence remains to be discovered. We can, if we like, believe that such an evolutionary system has taken place, but I, for one, do not think that it has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Then, after discussing the various aspects of each of the 7 non-provable assumptions upon which evolution is based, he observed this. The first point that I should like to make is that these 7 assumptions, by their nature, are not capable of experimental verification. In other words, they cannot be reproduced. We can't prove it. That's what he's saying. We can't tell you that something came from nothing because we cannot prove that something came from nothing. We can't do it. We don't have the evidence. We can't find any facts that lead us to that, is what he's saying. The evidence that supports it is not sufficiently strong to allow us to consider anything more than a working hypothesis. You know what that means? Remember, a hypothesis is an educated guess. So what we have is educated men trying to find one particular, one moment, one time, spontaneous generation, something coming from nothing. And they have worked at it, and 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 have come up with what? Nothing. The standard usage definition of a fact is something that is an actual occurrence, or something that has an actual existence. Can any process be called an actual occurrence when the knowledge of how, when, where, what, and why is missing? If someone suggested that a certain size skyscraper had merely happened, but the how, when, where, what, and why were complete unknowns, would you be likely to call it a fact or an unproven assertion? It's an unproven assertion. You say it's there, but how did it get there? We don't know how it got there. Well, you don't have the why, when, where, or how. You have to be able to answer the questions for all of those. To ask is to answer. When the best that evolutionists can offer is an insufficient explanation for life's origin in the first place, an equally inadequate mechanism for the evolution of that life once it somehow begin by naturalistic processes and a fossil record full of missing links to document its supposed course through time, we will continue to call their facts simply a theory, or better yet, a hypothesis, or just a plain assumption. Twisting the definition of the word fact is a poor attempt on the part of an evolutionist to add credibility to a theory that lacks any factual merit whatsoever. And it's not just creationists that have made this point. Even the evolutionists have admitted, and I'll show you. The well-known Australian molecular biologist and evolutionist Michael Denton addressed this very point in his 1985 book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. After admitting that no one ever has documented any evidence for the supposed evolutionary quote-unquote chain of life leading from one type of creature to another. In other words, Jesse, I'm telling you, you came from a one-celled amoeba. And eventually you became a fish, and eventually you became a bird, and eventually you became an orangutan, and eventually you became a human. That chain of events is nowhere to be found in the fossil record. That chain of events, the missing links, are nowhere to be found in any of the factual recordings of the record, fossil record, that's evident for anything.
They can't connect one to another.
They cannot connect them. There is no connection. And there is no connection. And the more we study science, we've gotten into the DNA of things, the more we study science and how they are broke down into the very DNA structure, we have found that there's so much different that it gets even greater, it becomes an even greater impossibility to find the missing link. Because the gaps become even larger, if you want to call them gaps. There are no gaps because they're all different, like it or lump it, right? But that's, in the evolutionary mind thinking, those gaps have become bigger. Dr. Denton wrote, "The concept of the continuity of nature has existed in the mind of man, never in the facts of nature." 13 years later, in his 1998 book, Nature's Destiny, he shocked everyone when he said, whether one accepts or rejects the design hypothesis, we accept the design hypothesis, don't we? We do. There is no avoiding the conclusion that the world looks as if it has been tailored for life. It appears to have been designed. This is an evolutionist saying this. All reality appears to be a vast, coherent, teleological whole with life and mankind as its purpose and goal. We agree with both of his statements. The facts of nature certainly do not support evolution, and the world most assuredly appears to have been what? Designed. Even evolutionists admit, although somewhat reluctantly at times, that design implies what? A designer. That's a really nice jean jacket you're wearing there. Who's the designer? You know there's a designer. You know somebody made it. You know somebody tailored it. You know all of that because you can trace it back. Right? If there's a design, there must be a designer. The question then comes to this. Who designed the universe? Right? If there's a design, there must be a designer. And if there's a designer, who is he? Right? It certainly was not those mythical parents, Father Time and Mother Nature. Although, don't laugh, it is pushed hard. Mother Nature is pushed very hard. And there's a reason for that. When you can divide it up, then you're not accountable to one or to two or three or four. You don't have. There's only one. Amen? Amen? They do not possess the ability to design anything because they don't exist. No such thing as Father Time, no such thing as Mother Nature. Mother Nature is actually just a modern day version of an old ideology of idol worship. You can go right back, study it way long time ago, thousands of years ago, the fertility goddess and all the different gods that they would worship. And that's where it all goes back to. And that's where it all has come to now. If you believe in Mother Nature, friend, you need to get out of that. That's idolatry. It is. Okay, we'll get on. I'll get past that. Everywhere we look in the world around us, we see evidence of the most intricate kind of design. We've looked at some of that. Remember the Bombardier beetle? The little guy who creates from 2 different acids inside of his body. Where does he get the acids, first of all? But creates them inside of his body, puts them all into an area. When it's time to shoot them off, he combines them together, creates combustion, and shoots them out at like phenomenal speeds, and it's an acid. Like, how is that possible? It's created, friend. It's created. We see intricate kind of design from our massive universe to the tiny cells of which we are made. God, not evolution, is responsible. That is the most impressive fact that we know. The Bible says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That means one who is devoid of any kind of wisdom or knowledge. A fool says in his heart, there is no God. And you know what? Even greater than that, a fool knows there is a God, but denies his existence to simply work on his own pleasure and to fulfill his own desires. One of the most impressive arguments for the theory of evolution is provided by the evidence from the comparative scientists. So when I compare something, let me give you an example. I'm going to compare Jer and Andrew. Do they look the same? A little bit. Do they have similarities? Yeah. They have the same parents. Is that a similarity? Right. So comparative, and when I talk about comparative sciences, it means the scientists that take different parts of science and compare them to other parts. So comparative anatomy, comparative physiology, comparative cytology, comparative biochemistry, you can go on. Scientists have worked in these various fields and have learned how to compare one organism with another. Excuse me. Basic similarities have been established between certain groups. When making comparisons of parts of organisms, scientists commonly speak of structures that are similar in appearance as opposed to those that are similar in function, suggesting that these particular structures go through similar stages of development and have similar attachments, etc., etc., etc. Charles Darwin thought the argument from homology, which is similar structures, similar appearance, was one of the greatest single proofs of his theory. He thought if something looks like something, then it must have come from something. I'm not going to pick on anybody tonight and say they look like a monkey's uncle. But if you look like something, maybe that's where you come from. That's the ideology behind that comparisons. He wrote this. He says, "We have seen that the members of the same class, independently of their habits of life, resemble each other in the general plan of their organization. Is it not powerfully suggestive of true relationship of inheritance from a common ancestor?" Admittedly, at first glance, descent from a common ancestor appears to be a logical argument. Apes can walk upright. They've got hands, thumbs. You know, they can do all that stuff. They look they have hair. They've got eyes and a nose. So comparative-wise, it would logically, you would think maybe it might actually make sense. After all, isn't it that how we explain such similarities as brothers and sisters looking more alike than their cousins? Why is this the case? It's because they have parents that are closer in common. Evolutionists have an impressive array of data at their disposal when you look at it that way. They are quick to point out that the wing of the bat, the forefoot of the turtle, the forefoot of the frog, and the arm of the man all have the same general structure. Evolutionists also know, don't laugh. Well, look, this is where his legs originally were, but there are no legs anymore. They talk about that. You'll see it. It happens. Evolutionists also note correctly that the forefoot of the dog, the flipper of the whale, and the hand of the man essentially have the same bones and muscles. Cool? In more recent times, this argument has been carried even to the molecular level as scientists begin to compare similarities in blood groups, cellular DNA, and a host of other molecular units. It has been announced, for example, that the chimpanzee and the human have DNA that is, you ready for this? Similar 95% of the time. Okay? That's true, that's fact. They can take you there. That's fact. Great. Awesome. What's the creationist response to all of this? Do similarities exist? And if so, is the evolutionist explanation the correct one that fits the facts of the case? First, let's see how the creationist does not respond to this argument. Creationists do not deny similarities. Absolutely there are similarities. Of course they're there. They're facts. We can see them. They're evidence. We can prove it. It's there. It can be reproduced. That's how we know they're there, right? Creationists are not ignorant of the existence of such similarities. It is here, however, that an extremely valuable lesson can be learned in the creation-evolution controversy. The lesson is this: rarely is it the facts that are in dispute. Instead, it is the interpretation placed on the facts that is in dispute. The interpretation. In cases of basic similarities, whether at the anatomical level or biochemical, right down to the small stuff, there is no good purpose to be served by denying that such similarities exist. Of course they exist. Creation and evolutionists both have the same set of facts. There they are. Similarities exist. They're there. The evolutionist, however, looks at the data and says that the similarity is proof of common ancestry. The creationist, on the other hand, examines the data and suggests that the similarity is evidence of creation according to common design. Get that? Why would you put a nose on creatures? So they can breathe. Because the atmosphere is made of air. And if I put a nose on it, they can breathe through it. And you know what? I'll make the design of the elephant's nose to be different than the design of Andrew's nose. Well, not a lot different. No, I'm just joking. But there are similarities because there are common designs. Common designer, the same designer. Both sides have an interpretation for the data. In many instances, either explanation might seem to work at first glance. However, we're going to look at this, and I'm almost done. The evolutionist argument is successful only if certain portions of the data are presented. Furthermore, consider this. If similarity proves common ancestry, then dissimilarity. If we have similar things, then there's got to be things that are also what? Not similar. Things that are similar, great, here they all are, look at that, wow, see this, see this, see this, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. Common ancestry, all look at the similar things, look at the similar things. But you've got to be able to look at all the facts, and if you look at all the facts, you've got to be able to look at the things that are not similar. And the things that are similar compared to the things that are not similar, that's when you've got the bigger picture. Whew. When evolutionists are allowed to pick and choose the similarities that fit evolutionary theory and reject the numerous differences, can the argument for common ancestry work? When evolutionists present all the facts, including those documenting dissimilarity, the argument fails completely. One scientist, a veterinarian, R.L. Weizog, provided an extensive list of such data, among which were the following examples. Here you go. You ready? Dissimilarities and similarities. We're going to talk about similar things. You ready? The octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog's face, the milk of the donkey, the pronator quadratus muscle of the Japanese salamander are all very similar to human structures. All those things are similar to human structures. Do these similarities show evolutionary relationship? Are we related then because the octopus eye looks like the human eye? Are we related because the pig's heart resembles the human heart? Are we related? Or do we come from the same original background? No. The weight of the brain in proportion to the body weight is greater in the dwarf monkey of South America, the marmoset, than it is in the man. He's got a bigger brain than we do. Since this proportion is used to show relationship between primates and man, is the marmoset therefore more evolved than us?
Must be then.
Because that's something that's used as evidence that we have evolved into a greater being. And he's a similar creature, but he's got a bigger brain. Does that mean he's more evolved than us? The root nodules of certain bean plants, leguminous plants, and the crustacean Daphnia contain hemoglobin, the blood pigment that's found in us. Are these organisms closely related to us? Well, some of us might be bean plants. No, I'm just teasing. Such differences have caused evolutionists to search for a way to salvage the argument from homology, or that ancestry. Thus, they have turned to molecular studies to establish common ancestry based on it. However, molecular studies in the past few years have yielded no better results. In other words, they've gone to the DNA and said, hey, well, let's look at the DNA, and maybe that'll show us a better idea, a better picture of what we mean by ancestral or being related to these creatures. Does that make sense? I wanted to actually put this up on the screen, but I forgot to put it on the back. So let me just give you a little chart. So evolution says that we've come from what? Nothing to something, life. Then that life has gone from simple life to what? Complex life. We're complex life. Okay? So that's how evolution works. Okay? So that would mean that the man, us, we would consider ourselves to be where? On the top. We're at the high end of the evolutionary scale. Whereas a creature like the crayfish would be on the lower end of the evolutionary scale. Below us would be what? We would think a dog would be lower than us, a bat would be lower than us, a herring gull would be lower than us, reptiles, a fern, a plant, would be lower than us, okay? So you get that scale. So man, dog, bat, herring gull, reptile, fern, crayfish, okay? Just imagine that scale. Now let's look at their chromosome count in their DNA. Because if we have evolved and we are better, we should have what? A greater count of what? Chromosomes. Okay. Out of that list that I gave you, the second last one, the fern, the plant, its chromosome count is 512. It's the highest of that list. The next one after that is the last one that I told you about, the crayfish. He has 200 chromosomes in his DNA. After that, the dog has 78 chromosomes in his DNA. I haven't yet mentioned man. But we're higher advanced, aren't we? Shouldn't we have the most genetic information inside of us if evolutionary theory works? The herring gull has 68 chromosomes. The reptiles have 48 chromosomes in their DNA structure. Man has 46. On that little list of 7, we are second last. And that's only out of 7 out of millions and millions and millions. The bat was 32. Think about that.
Their own theory would say that, though, the chromosomes should be getting longer and longer and longer.
Absolutely. The theory would be, and here we go again, theory can be reproduced. So is it a theory? Let's back up. What comes before a theory? An educated hypothesis or educated assumption, and then there's an assumption. Friend, they're still way back here. They are nowhere near the facts. The facts are pointing which way? The opposite way. The chromosome count does not fit what has been predicted based upon the theory of evolution, since one of the predictions of the theory is increased complexity. In other words, things get smarter and wiser and better, and it's not there. The facts simply do not agree with the predictions. Evolutionists suggest that as one ascends the tree of life, organisms should become increasingly separated by differences in biochemistry from the earliest and most primitive organisms. But they aren't. It's not anything like that. Matter of fact, it's all over the random scale. It's everywhere. A fern, a plant, has more DNA than you and I. It has more genetic information in it to make it a fern than it does to make us human beings. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. Not according to evolution. But it does make sense according to what? Creative design. God created it. Amen? He made it all. The facts point us to the things that we can reproduce, the things that we know, the things that we can understand and say, hey, look, these are the facts. These are real. They're in existence at this moment right now. The facts point us away from the whole idea of evolution and point us in the direction of what? A design, a designer. And that has to lead you somewhere. That has to lead you to God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Why don't we stand? Hey, buddy. You know what? To say that I come from a one-celled organism, or I come from a monkey, you know what that does? It does one thing. It destroys the importance of who